Mr. Gillam, it's a pleasure to serve under you in my first debate on the front bench. I would like to congratulate the Right Honourable Member for the Cities of London and Westminster for securing this debate and thank him for the courtesy of sharing what he was going to cover with me today in advance. This is not the first time he and I have spoken on issues of housing in London in this room in the short time I've been in Parliament. I'd also like to thank the Almshouses Association for their briefing for this debate. I also welcome the formation of the APPG on Almshouses under the co-chairmanship of the Right Honourable Member for Cities and Westminster and also my colleague, the Honourable Member for Halifax. As the Right Honourable Member described so eloquently, almshouses have been around for centuries, long before the advent of council and housing association housing. And as the Honourable Member for Strangford has clearly described, they continue to provide a valuable place in the provision of housing in this country. They particularly benefit people such as pensioners and people with disabilities, those on low incomes, and occasionally to others, specific groups such as ex-services personnel. In my constituency, we have several almshouses. The Isleworth and Hounslow charity manages 80 units spread over 6 sites for couples and also for single people. It's an amalgamation of a number of small almshouses and distributive charities. The oldest, Ingram's, was endowed in 1664, and the most recent is Tolson House, part funded by the HCA, and it opened in 2012. One of the strengths of the almshouses is their local connection, local trustees. Many provide on-site staff, a social focus, and a support element. And in addition to the human side of providing homes, the older almshouse charities are preserving an important part of our nation's built heritage. So, Mrs. Gillam, while almshouses may be historic, they're certainly very much alive and vibrant and playing an important role in the mixed housing economy in our communities, particularly for those who cannot own or even afford to buy their own homes. Before addressing the specific points raised by the Right Honourable Member for Cities of London and Westminster, I want to start by setting the place of almshouses within the wider context of all supported and social rent housing. Here, we've seen 6 years of failure, leading to the greatest housing crisis this country has seen for many decades. House building is at the lowest level under any Prime Minister since 1923. Rough sleeping has doubled. Private rents have risen faster than incomes. The number of new government-funded social rented homes has fallen by an astonishing 98% since 2010. And housing benefit has risen by over $4 billion a year in cash terms, despite a series of punitive cuts. The pressure on all providers of supported and social rent housing could not be more difficult, and almshouses have not been spared. So, Mrs. Gillam, having set the scene, I'd now like to turn to each of the points the Right Honourable makes. First, the issue of licensing. The Right Honourable Member seeks a statutory instrument to exempt almshouses from the relevant legislation. Now, local authorities have discretion over fees and licensing regime, which is there to catch rogue private landlords. And I'm sure that almshouses are able to work with their local authority to ensure that the licensing regimes don't bring them into the ambit meant for a completely different purpose. However, I understand there are some set categories for exemptions which they have to follow and which presumably don't include non-registered almshouses, which is the reason for the concern the Honourable Member makes. So if he is suggesting that local authorities should have more discretion than at present to amend who is covered by the licensing regime, then we would have some sympathy with that. Secondly, moving to the National Planning Policy Framework and planning obligations. The Right Honourable Member says that some local authorities have interpreted non-registered almshouses as being essentially private developers and therefore required them to carry out Section 106 obligations to provide affordable housing when that is essentially what they do as their core business anyway. Well, anyway, Mrs. Gillam, this could and indeed should be a matter for local negotiation. Section 106 agreements are locally negotiated and agreed on. And for myself, having spent some years as the chair of my local authority's planning committee and many years as a planning committee member, I'm well acquainted with the powers of the planning system and the ability to have local discretion according to local circumstances and need. Nevertheless, I acknowledge this is an area where some clarity and guidance from the department would perhaps be helpful, both to almshouses and to planning authorities. And we need to deliver more urgently the much-needed affordable housing. And on this side, we share with the Honourable Member for Linthogrove East Falkirk the importance of delivering many more good quality, truly affordable homes, and soon. Thirdly, the Right Honourable Member raised concerns from almshouses that the rent cut for social rent housing might impact on almshouses once the first year exemption is over. On this side of the House, we regret the arbitrary rent cut has potentially compromised the building of new affordable homes and has damaged the relationship between providers and the government. It's led to plans for development of new affordable housing being scaled back at a time of devastating cuts in social housing investment since 2010. And finally, on cuts to local housing allowance for supported housing, the Secretary of State for Housing, the Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, my colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Wentworth and Dearne, has led opposition to this since last December. It is dangerous and damaging to cap housing support for some of the most vulnerable people and uprate it by a measure of inflation, CPI, which explicitly excludes housing costs. The Almshouse Association is not alone in expressing concern about the government's plans to introduce a cap on the amount of rent that housing benefit will cover, because it will mean that housing benefit for social sector tenants cannot be higher than the local housing allowance rate for private rent tenants. The measure was due to apply to tenancies signed after the 1st of April this year and come into force from 1st of April 2018 onwards for everyone else. However, in March this year, following pressure from the shadow front bench, the government announced a one-year exemption for tenants of supported housing. In July this year, my shadow front bench colleagues secured an opposition day debate in which they called on the government to fully exempt supported housing from its cuts to housing benefit and to consult with supporting housing providers to identify ways in which all vulnerable people who need supporting housing can access it. In September, immediately before the conference recess, the government announced through a written statement that it would be deferring the application of LHA rates to social rents for supporting housing further, now until 2019-20. However, the government will be going ahead with the cut to supporting housing providers from next April. The written statement, Mrs. Gillan, raised more questions than it answered. The policy is delayed, but the cuts will go ahead. There is no figure on the new funding pledged, yet the budget scored the so-called savings of £990 million. Furthermore, government announcements on the LHA cut have stalled the development of many new supported housing schemes, as I've already mentioned. I am concerned that the government decision to delay detailing their cuts to supported housing will leave tens of thousands of the most vulnerable people without the certainty they need to live their lives. The written statement lacked important details relating to the top-up funding that will be devolved to local authorities and on the new funding arrangements. I believe that the continuous delays in outlining a complete package of support for almshouses and indeed the whole supported housing sector are unacceptable. It is vital that supported housing is fully exempt from these cuts. Otherwise, as the Honourable Member for Strangford has so clearly explained, we risk pushing more pensioners into the far more costly care system. In conclusion, Mrs. Gillan, the almshouses, along with all providers of social and affordable housing, deserve to be treated with the same degree of respect by this government as they treat their residents. Thank you.
Mrs. Gillan, it's a pleasure to